Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Rabbi Akiva, for inviting me. Shalom, everyone. And first of all, Chag Sameach to us all. This is the eve of Shavuot, where we received, according to our tradition, the Torah. And obviously, it's a momentous occasion which we should all remember. I also want to remind you at this occasion that this past Friday, which was May 14th, Eve of Shabbat, marked precisely the 73rd anniversary of Israel's Declaration of Independence, which also happened on May 14th on the Eve of Shabbat in 1948. That obviously doesn't happen every year. Worth remembering. I think that what we're experiencing right now, not only in Israel, but the world over, is a major crisis. And I'm not talking about what's happening in Israel. I'm talking about the trajectory of where this world is going to. And I think that one of the main issues that should bother or worry every intelligent, probing individual is that, in my humble opinion, of course, everything is my humble opinion, the world is rapidly losing its ability to dialogue with one another. What we're witnessing around the world is a humdrum of parallel monologues of different nations, different fractions, different politics, different ideologies, who are further entrenching themselves in their own views and are literally becoming less and less able to become what is known as resilient listeners. People are able to listen beyond their own zone of comfort. So I would like to say a few words about dialogue and resilient listening in a Jewish perspective. As we are celebrating Matan Torah, the reception of the Torah, I feel quite comfortable saying, and Rebale and Kim and many of you have learned with me before know this, I've said it many times before, that even our own midrashim state in more than one occasion that what happened on Mount Sinai, when we talk about Mount Sinai, it is not necessarily about what God said, but rather about what did the people of Israel hear. And indeed, the most essential element of Jewish liturgy is not say, O Israel, but rather hear, O Israel. Shema Israel, lend your ear to wisdom, lend your ear to enlightenment. My friends, we live in an era where we are a bombardment of information and almost zero knowledge. We swim in a murky ocean of data that lends itself to very little acquisition of wisdom. And we're all swimming in these murky waters where there is an alarming inverse relationship between people's ability to access information and a much lesser ability to engage in the acquisition of knowledge. We are drowning in content with no access whatsoever to context. And without these elements, it's becoming more and more challenging for us, and let alone the next generation, to exercise what I believe is a dialogue between people, and that's between two people, between families, between tribes, between ethnicities, between political fractions, between ideological fractions, and between nations, yes. So I would like, with your permission, in the few minutes that I have, to say a few words about what is it that constitutes a dialogue, in my opinion, and within a Jewish context. Number one, a dialogue is a self-standing value. It is not a means to a higher end, but rather an end in and of itself. Our ability to talk to one another should be seen as a self-standing value, as an autonomous ethical quest. Number two, and by extension, a dialogue and the application of a dialogue is not contingent on agreement. The chief purpose of a dialogue is clarification rather than persuasion. Number three, when we enter a dialogue, a true dialogue requires guts, requires courage. It's what Rabbi Joshua Heschel once said: to become dangerously involved in the life of another, to lend your ear in such a manner that listening to someone else speak might rattle you beyond your own zone of preconceived assumptions and comfort. Most people find this very threatening. Another element of dialogue is the ability to understand or to befriend multiple truths and not a single truth. If you believe in a single truth, you cannot enter a dialogue, because your ability to be proven right is inherently contingent on your ability to prove the other wrong. That will never constitute a true dialogue. That's an argument. And the fifth point, as we read in the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, Reshit Chochma, Kne Chochma, the beginning of wisdom is to acquire wisdom. Know what you're talking about. Bring substance, conviction to your claims. This is becoming rapidly more challenging in a world of surfers who do not know how to dive. People who surf from one bit of data to another and make very strong opinions based on that surfing. The acquisition of knowledge demands that we are patient, that we are able to befriend certain ambiguities, and that we are humble enough to understand that we don't have monopoly over truth. We need to ask ourselves today, what is our ability to dialogue with our brothers and sisters, to dialogue with our neighbors, to dialogue with those with whom we agree, and to dialogue with those with whom we disagree? Again, meaning that dialogue is not contingent upon agreement. That's not the purpose of a dialogue. We need to ask ourselves whether today's zeitgeist is merely a polite embrace of someone else's quote unquote, freedom to speak? Or are we truly going to make that leap of faith and offer them the honor of being heard? That responsibility and that right should be, must be reciprocal. Reciprocal. I'm obliged to listen, and the other side is obliged to listen to me. In my experience, true dialogues, as rare as they may be, often lead very differing individuals and parties to realize that they actually have much more common than meets the eye, and that sometimes they are both driven from the same values and beliefs, albeit they opt to express them in radically different ways. A dialogue allows us to tap into the motivations of people and not only their actions. These are all extremely, extremely difficult blocks to pass. Truth be told, it is much easier to live amongst those who perpetuate your existing belief system. Even more than that, one engages their whole life in building a belief system, so it is only obvious that one would feel very uncomfortable, to say the least, when this belief system comes to a question. And here, I want to introduce the term narrative into our discussion before I say a few words very briefly about what's happening here in this country in the last week or so. I don't believe in the term history. I think that history is a very manipulative term. I believe that there are narratives of people who perceive events from a certain perspective. A narrative is the ability to fashion a story that bears relevance and meaning to any group of people. But I want to make a very clear distinction between a narrative, a myth, a legend, or a lie. A narrative is a story fortified by meaning, values, and beliefs. Many elements in narratives are fortified by historical facts, for sure. But a narrative is always bigger than the accumulated facts that give it rise. It is not a lie, it is not a deceit, it is not a manipulation. It is the driving force of individuals, as it is the driving force of people in our perpetual attempt to infuse meaning into our lives, and in our perpetual desire to understand that our personal lives are interlinked to those of a community. In our case, the Jewish narrative and the Jewish people. And the story of Israel, the people, the land, and the state. That does not mean by any means that every narrative is legitimate, because we need to investigate responsibly each narrative and see what is it comprised of. My narrative does not give me permission to fortify it by lies. It does not give me permission to fortify it by manipulation. It definitely does not give me permission to fortify it by my reliance on other people's ignorance. A narrative is not an exact science, that's for sure. But the human spirit is also not an exact science. A narrative is filled with meaning-making processes that give meaning to our lives. And the reason I'm saying this is because I feel that at certain points, the term narrative became somewhat a parve term in today's discourse. Everybody is entitled to their own narrative, and we'll take it from there. No, that's not the case in my opinion. First of all, when you hold on to a narrative with all of its colors and the disagreements which it entails, it is still our narrative. And at every given moment, there comes a time, there comes a moment, as rare as it may be, where we as a people should put all of our important and legitimate differences aside and stand united behind certain things that I personally believe are sacred to the maintenance of our narrative. One of which being Israel's right to exist as a sovereign, free, Jewish homeland, irrespective of anyone's consent on the face of this earth. This is our right, period. There are certain elements in a narrative that are beyond contestation and should remain as such. And that is my segue to the last thing I want to say in the next 2 minutes before I have, and again, I deeply apologize that I have to leave. As you all know, I'm sure that you see it on TV and you see the news and everything that you see there. Israel is undergoing a major campaign in this last week. Over 2,500 missiles have been shot on us in less than 7 days. And Israel has been retaliating fiercely in the last week, fiercely so. Some people may say, well, it's a war. One fights the other one fights the other. No, it's not. This is not a war. This is a clash. This is a fundamental clash of narratives, which I believe each and every one of you needs to understand. We are not at war with the Palestinian people. This is not a war against Palestinians. This is a war against Hamas. And I urge you, each and every one of you, to read the Hamas charter. Read it. That says that there will never be an acknowledgement of the state of Israel, that all diplomatic relations, all negotiations, all affairs of negotiating and speaking to the Zionist entity are futile endeavors, and that Hamas will not lay down its arms until Israel is vanquished as a Jewish state and Hamas gains hold of this entire land as a Palestinian land. That's the narrative we're dealing with. Obviously, you can understand that we're not even remotely close to the possibility of a dialogue the way I just outlined it. This is not a narrative. This is a statement of destruction. So I, as an Israeli, as a Jew, as a proud Zionist, and as Zohar Raviv, I'm speaking only on my behalf. And I can tell you that from what I've been seeing here in Israel for the last 7 days, I believe that over 95% of the country agree with me that Israel needs to stand tall, and you need to stand tall as Jews, as members of this community, as our brothers and sisters, and say there are narratives and there should be a dialogue by all means, but there will not be a dialogue with anyone who doesn't recognize my right to exist. If that's the claim, if you want to kill me, I will kill you first. Period. I know it sounds harsh, my friends, but this is a harsh reality. And you're surrounded by a lot of people right now who find it extremely easy to criticize from the comfort of their homes, where their children are not a danger, where their babies are not in the shelter 5 times a day. My friends, I'm not asking you to agree with everything, but there is time for disagreement. There is time for unity. There is time where we can argue with one another until we're blue in the face. And I welcome such moments because they are important to the cohesion of the Jewish people and to our moral standards. But there are times also where Jews, wherever they are, should stand as one and say, right now, we are behind Israel. We will talk with you later. And this is such a time. I'm getting a note here from the car that came to pick me up outside my apartment right now. So I'm sorry that I have to say all this and leave immediately. I want to bless all of us with, seriously, with peace, with dignity, with honor, with life, and wish us all a Chag Sameach. And I pray that each and every one of you stands firm and tall and is not ashamed to say, I stand with Israel.